You're listening to the Business for Good podcast, the show where you'll hear inspirational stories about companies making money by solving some of the world's most pressing problems. I'm your host, Paul Shapiro, and I'm glad you've joined us. Hello, friend, and welcome to episode 168 of the Business for Good podcast. As I am recording this in June 2025, I just received some very good news that's really made my day and might make you smile too. I recently came across a dirty and hungry but very friendly stray pit bull who was dragging a cable, not even a leash, behind him in the shoulder of the freeway. Well, after collecting him and bringing him home to bathe and feed him and letting him play with my dog Eddie, I took him to our local animal shelter where I hoped that maybe he would get a better shot at a new chapter in life. Well, I just got some photos from the animal shelter of this 1-year-old pup with his new adoptive family, and man, does he look happy. You can see them on my personal Facebook page, but in short, while my wife Tony named him Moses during the couple hours he stayed with us, he is now Sir Budward, aka Buddy. And Buddy seems to really be enjoying his new life. While it was a very short and minor event in my life, hopefully it will prove to be a turning point for this very affable young guy who voraciously consumed everything I gave him without wasting a morsel. Now, speaking of voraciously consuming food without wasting it, this episode is about using food waste to make valuable commodities. You like that transition? Pretty good. Okay, well, what if we could turn the mountains of food waste that we generate every day into high-value chemicals that replace fossil fuels and palm oil, two of the most environmentally destructive inputs in our economy? That's exactly what this episode's guest is doing. Marc den Hartog is the CEO of ChainCraft, a Dutch biotech company using fermentation to convert agricultural waste into medium-chain fatty acids, the essential building blocks for everything from fats and foods to lubricants to bioplastics and fragrances. Founded as a spinoff from Wageningen University, yes, I like to say that to prove that I can pronounce it, Wageningen University, ChainCraft is pioneering open culture fermentation processes that offer a scalable, circular alternative to petroleum-based chemicals. And they are not just operating at the lab bench. In addition to having raised 40 million euros in investment so far, the company already has a pilot facility in Amsterdam producing 2,000 tons of fatty acids per year, with plans for a full-scale industrial plant underway. Marc joined ChainCraft after a distinguished career in the chemical industry, including senior roles at Corbion and other global players. Now he's applying that expertise to scale a clean tech company aiming to rewire one of the dirtiest parts of our supply chains, chemical production, into a model of sustainability. In this conversation, Marc and I talk about how ChainCraft's technology works, why food waste is a goldmine of untapped value, and what it'll take for his team to go from demo plant to commercial scale. If you care about the future of sustainable industry, the circular economy, or just finding smarter ways to deal with the waste problem that we already produce, you are going to love this conversation. Marc, welcome to the Business for Good podcast.
Paul, great to be here. Thank you.
I love the shirt that you're wearing. People are only listening on audio, so tell me, what does your shirt say?
Well, the sweater says, because there is no planet B, Paul.
All right. Yes, I'm constantly amazed at how many people I know who think that we may have some meaningful settlements on the moon or on Mars. And I always think, this isn't like going from the old world to the new world. Like when the old worlders came to the new world, there was still air they could breathe. There were still trees and plants and animals, right? I always think we're not going to be farming the moon. We're not going to be farming Mars, at least not in our lifetimes. And so we have a real serious, urgent crisis going on here. But I don't know, do you think that someday we may be farming other celestial bodies, or do you think that this is it?
Well, I think the only person in the world that has done that so far was Matt Damon in a movie called The Martian. But
yes.
No, not on short term. And I think also ultimately our planet doesn't really care the mess we make out of it, but it's in our interest, and especially all the other living creatures and generations to come. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. I have a friend whose name is Matt Ball, who regularly talks about how it doesn't matter what happens to the planet, so to speak, but rather all of the sentient beings on the planet, human and non-human, who actually matter. Certainly, the planet has endured massive asteroids and all types of changes in its atmosphere in the past. But, we're ushering in a mass extinction event as we speak, and it certainly is a terrible thing to be doing. So hopefully the work that we're going to be talking about today will give us a little bit of a better chance on planet A here than, since there is no planet B, as your shirt says. So let's talk about that. I'm eager to hear about how this all got started. Like, what happened with ChainCraft? Like, you were working at a huge company in the chemical and fermentation space, a huge ingredients provider around the globe. And then you thought, let me go work at a small startup instead. So big difference. So what happened for you that led to this?
Yeah, big difference to be seen. I think overall, Paul, you said rightfully so. I've been working most of my career with large corporate enterprises, starting off with Unilever and then later on with Corbion, indeed a leader in industrial biotech. Been with them for about 8 years on their executive committee, and there you see ultimately, what you can do to make a big impact at scale globally. But of course, ultimately, it also requires new ventures that explore more disruptive ideas. And that's within the walls of a corporate enterprise, always slightly more difficult than when you do that in a small startup or scale up. And yeah, believe it or not, I've been exposed to ChainCraft already a couple of years ago from my role at Corbion. And there I got to engage with the founder, who was back then the CEO. We talked about his venture and his scaling. And ultimately now 5 years down the road, the company is at a point where actually it will be scaled to industrial scale, which is also where, for me, is the right time to move in. And I'm just over 50, and this is my first entrepreneurial job. So, the learning journey doesn't end, Paul.
No, that's really cool. In fact, if you read the book Super Founders, I know that you're not the founder of ChainCraft, but if you read the book Super Founders, they claim that there's really no correlation on age for a successful founder or a successful CEO, that there are plenty of people who start companies or join companies as CEO later, right? Like in your 50s or even 60s, that can do very well. And there's no reason why they should do worse than somebody who's in their 20s or 30s. In fact, there's probably a lot of reasons they should do better. But apparently there's no real age correlation with success in startups. But working at these large corporates, like you're talking about Corbion, for those not familiar, this is a massive, massive company. In fact, if my memory is correct, didn't they acquire Solozyme after Solozyme had some?
Absolutely. And I'm nowadays also proud to say that I was the business owner that actually managed to acquire the assets of Solozyme.
Interesting.
And actually, reanimate it and bring it back to life and unlock the power of that algae platform, which still, fortunately, today is a very flourishing part of what Corbion is today.
Yeah, that's really cool. And so for those not initiated, Solozyme was a startup that did really well for a while. And they had an algae platform that was making all types of really cool algae-based foods and other things. I think they built a big fermentation factory in Brazil. And they even IPO'd, right? And then they struggled and ultimately were acquired by Corbion, which is still selling like some cool whole algae ingredients, which are delicious. I've actually eaten them before and really liked them.
Yeah, and I think also that, as you said, there's no age to be put on CEOs of scaling businesses. But I think, losing some hairs and getting gray hairs over the years has of course been part of what you bring along in that couple of years of experience. Also seeing how other companies have grown, have scaled, some successfully, others too fast, redoing their business models. And that's the experience that you gain ultimately working in this industry. And that I hope that I can apply now to ChainCraft.
Yeah. Interesting. So I want to get into that, including what ChainCraft is doing, Marc, but I just have to ask because I'm so curious. I can't restrain myself. You went from being in a large battleship, right? And you talked about how it's difficult for them to be entrepreneurial, difficult for large corporates to be innovative. And now you are no longer on a battleship, rather you are on a swift boat, right? A smaller startup, but you're the captain of the swift boat. How has that experience been for you? What's the difference for you in your lifestyle?
Well, I think if you look at the kind of challenges that you deal with, they're actually very similar from a business perspective, right? It's ultimately about making sure you connect with large global international clients, which are in most of the cases corporates, which ultimately are the same people you deal with. You have financing challenges, right? There's not an unlimited amount of resources, even not at big companies. So there's a lot of similarities, I must say, in terms of complexity of the challenges you're dealing with. But of course, what's very different is that you're not with 4,000 employees or something like that, but you're with 40 colleagues. And that on Wednesday afternoon, you'll get the local retailer to deliver, bread and stuff to eat and salads, and you can play some table football and throw some darts, which is a very different atmosphere. And I can also say that my day is not fully booked with Zoom or Teams calls. That allows also to have some time for reflection, to work around, have some conversations, but also have more room for spontaneous meetings. So I think those are definitely things that are very beneficial when you move to a smaller company. Yeah, and of course, on top of that, ultimately the amount of freedom I have in my role, to shape the company, to give the strategic direction, is of course a big difference, and that's very enjoyable.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've talked to other people who are in your shoes, Marc, and I've asked them which they preferred, like the security of a large company or maybe more of the freedom, but insecurity of a smaller startup. And universally rather, they tell me they prefer the small startup. I don't, maybe that's just self-selection of the people who I talk with, but sometimes people like that freedom. Okay. So ChainCraft, what does it mean? Why is it called ChainCraft?
Yeah, so at ChainCraft, we believe in a world where all chemistry is circular, and what we do is, of course, in that chemical industry, and that's the industry of industries. Ultimately, being a chemist, I can say that wholeheartedly, the foundation of a lot of other industries. We do that by actually making chemical building blocks called fatty acids, and we make them not from fossil sources, but we actually make them from residue streams from the agriculture and food sectors. And that's what we do with fermentation. We're probably going to talk a lot about what we exactly do. And those chemical building blocks, they're used in everyday life products that people use in their households, in the food they eat, in the products they use for personal care, how they clean their homes. And that makes it, I think, on all modest scale that we are operating, still a very meaningful contribution.
And so chain, I'm presuming, is coming from a chain of fatty acids, right? So your craft is that you are creating these chains through fermentation rather than from fossil fuels. So you briefly alluded, Marc, to the fact that we're using fatty acids in our life. But for people who aren't familiar, like what is something that they're using every day that is comprised of fatty acids? Like why would somebody care about making fatty acids in the first place?
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's good to know that for the listeners as well, that fatty acids are made by nature every day. And I think they're in what we have around us. Fatty acids generally provide an acidity to products, a natural preservation to food and to things in the environment, and a certain contribution to ultimately making nature a bit better. So I think the fact that fatty acids aren't new to the world, but they're already there, makes it also for us in that sense much easier to relate to. Coming back to your comment on the name, and that's maybe good to allude to that a bit further as well, why that part of the chain is in what we craft. It's ultimately that in our technology, we're not only using those agri-food residues to make those building blocks, but we have actually a core technology in which we extend the length of the carbon chain, which makes up the backbone of a fatty acid. And that's what we're ultimately all about.
Cool. So when you're thinking about these fatty acids, like, some people might think about palm oil as an example, right? As something that is a big driver of deforestation. It would be great if we could make it without having to farm palm trees. One point that I have made and others have made on this podcast in the past is that switching away from palm oil to, let's say, coconut oil does not really help, right? Like coconut trees are far less productive than palm trees. And so you would actually have to deforest a lot more if you switched from palm oil to coconut oil. So it's not that there's something bad about palm trees. It's just they're so efficient that they're the most grown tree of these tropical oils. But if we could divorce the creation of these tropical oils and tropical fats from agriculture and instead put it into a fermentation system, including one that's fed by agricultural side streams like what you're referring to, and when I get into that, that would really be the way to try to reduce the amount of land that's needed to make all of these tropical oils that we're using. What do you think?
I think we live in a world where the challenges are so big that we need it all to fire on all cylinders. And maybe good to know as well that over 20 years ago, I was a huge ambassador for palm oil, and especially certified responsibly farmed palm oil. Been a board member at the RSPO, the certification body that actually lined up stakeholders across the value chain to make sure that practices would improve and that deforestation would stop. But I think our endless consumption of things like palm oil is just so big that there's no system in the world that can make sure that doesn't go at the expense of things like ecosystems. So I consider what we do really complementary as a need to, fulfill the demand that continues to grow. And it's not only palm oil, it's also ultimately the amount of fossil-based products that people are using. A lot of our clients actually look for deforestation-free products, but also like to improve their carbon footprint and like to reduce emissions. And that's where, biogenic carbon, the carbon that comes from nature, is going to help them. And we leverage that to bring those products to them.
All right, cool. So let's talk about what you're actually doing. Most of the time, if people listen to the show, they're familiar with fermentation systems in which you have a sterile process. You're feeding it pure glucose. You are creating a fermentation where you're going to feed sugar in, and you're going to get some protein or biomass or enzyme out. This is not exactly what you're doing. So tell us, how is the type of fermentation that you're doing different from that?
Yeah. So what we do is we actually take the organic feedstock. And like I said, the source can be anything. We use only, I must say, plant-based. So I think that's the key differentiation there.
Right. And to be clear, by the use of organic, you don't mean organic as opposed to conventional. You just mean it's coming from biological materials here.
Exactly.
Right.
So it can be fruit cuttings. It can be household kitchen waste. It can be a supermarket out-of-date products. And it can be agricultural residue streams from things like wheat, sugar beet production, and potato production. And all that organic matter normally would already be degraded by fermentation because of all the organisms that are in there that degrade long chains of organic matter into shorter chains. And ultimately, if you doesn't stop that, it all turns into biogas, which is either methane or CO2 and other, I would say, basic C1 molecules. Now, what we do in our fermentation, we take the feedstock and we actually cultivate the organisms that are in there, and we create a system in which we propagate the ones that do what we want to do. So ultimately, we don't have any foreign microorganisms. We just use the one that nature gives us and make sure that the system in which we put them, let's call it the jacuzzi, has all the right conditions, the right temperature, and the right bubbling to make sure that we get the molecules we want. It's a two-stage process. And in the first stage, we actually acidify and hydrolyze the long chains so that they're actually broken down. That's a very generic process. I already mentioned biogas production. And that's also how modern biogas plants would operate. So it's a normal digestion, similar to in a biogas plant, where you actually create short-chain molecules. What we do is we actually stop it when they are actually broken down to like 2 carbons, just before they actually would turn into biogas.
And so let me ask you, Marc, you're running this fermentation. Is the organism that you're utilizing public? I presume this is in your patent. So is this a fungus, a bacteria? What is actually doing the fermentation?
Yeah, so what we operate with is, as you already alluded to, not a single source organism. So it's not a yeast or an algae that you can actually selectively grow and is designed for making certain products, but we use what we call a mixed culture. So it consists of a lot of different bacteria. There's also fungi and other things in there, but ultimately we make sure that ultimately the bacteria that convert the feedstock into the molecules we want is actually dominant in the reactor.
Interesting. So normally in a fermentation, you need very constant non-variable parameters, right? You need a constant source of the same carbon source coming in, the same amounts of nitrogen. Like you really want a very non-variable source. What you're describing, though, sounds inherently variable, right? You're talking about fruit peels and potato juice and wheat residues and so on, right? So how do you maintain a constant final output when your inputs are constantly changing?
Yeah, and that's where actually that second step is so crucial. So once we've broken it down to this short chain carbon, we actually put it in our second stage of fermentation with the same mixed culture. And that's where actually we're going to elongate the chain. And the chain length we're after is optimized for C6, which is hexanoic acid, and some C4, which is butyric acid. And then there's slivers of other fatty acids around it, like C5 and C7 and C8. But ultimately, the C6 and C4 are the dominant ones. And of course, that part of the process where we want one single, I would say, chain elongator to be active, that's of course where we have to control the fermentation conditions very tightly. But you're right, it's a non-sterile process. It's very resilient, but making sure that the conditions are stable very precise. That's key to creating an economic process.
And so it sounds like what you have is extremely valuable, right? You've got a technology that can convert waste products into something very valuable. And you can do it for far more cheaply than other types of biotech fermentation, since you're running a non-sterile process and you can have these very inexpensive inputs as a carbon source. What is there to stop a Corbion or a DSM or any other major corporate from just doing what you're doing? Like, do you guys have some IP protection on here? Like, if you guys figured it out, why can't those companies with thousands of employees and lots of really smart people figure this out too?
Yeah, so I think first of all, even big companies apply a certain focus to what they do, and they look at their core competencies and don't deviate too far from that. And as we already talked about, a large industrial biotech player has a house organism, whether it's a genetically engineered yeast or a certain fungi or a converting bacteria. That's ultimately that they use as a tech platform to create new molecules from. So switching your whole base to something which is an open mixed culture platform is quite complex, even for large companies. I don't exclude that if open mixed culture technology becomes very sizable, that also the big players at a certain stage will look at it. But I think in the world where we are today, they have their own focus and place to play, and companies like ChainCraft have theirs. If you talk about the differentiation, yeah, we do have IP and a lot of trade secrets around our core technology, which is the chain elongation part. Because ultimately it requires that tight process control and understanding also how the different feedstocks with all their contaminants and other residues that they have with them, how you avoid that they are becoming a factor of influence on your fermentation.
Right. The way that I describe it is, people are generally not accustomed to knowing about what I call microbial farming, right? Like the idea. And so I always compare it to, if you're running a chicken farm, generally speaking, you only want chickens in the chicken farm, right? Like, you don't want raccoons or turkeys or deer in there eating all of that corn, because you just want the corn to go into your chickens. And the same is true here. You only want the microbes that you want in there. And there's lots of contaminants that can get in. And so you don't want yeast or bacteria, which are ever present, especially, I'm sure, on these agricultural side streams. So that is definitely a tricky thing. I do want to ask you, Marc, about the partnership that you have. So there was recently some news where you guys have a partnership with a major potato processor in Europe, and it's described as using potato juice. So first of all, I don't even know what potato juice is. Is that like the water that is after you blanch a potato? Is that potato juice? Like, what is the potato juice and what are you making from it?
Yeah, I'm laughing a bit because indeed people generally know about potato peels, but not about potato juice. And it's also something I don't recommend to try drinking, Paul. But
It sounds more like a punishment for a kid who has done something bad to make them drink.
So let me allude to that. So actually, if you look at potatoes, there's the kind of two big crops out there. There's of course the potatoes that are used for making fries, full potato products, which we all know as things we can buy in out of home or use in our own kitchens. And then there's the potatoes that are specially grown for their starch content. And those are starch potatoes. And in that starch processing facility, they actually extract the starch from the potato, which is the main ingredient. They'll take out protein, which is often a very good food ingredient. And then what's left is indeed the waste water that contains still organic matter and other components. So think of mineral salts that are in there, like potassium-rich mineral salts, and a lot of floating oligosaccharides, sugar molecules, a bit of peptides, and a lot of other molecules that are still valuable from our perspective.
Okay, so I'm envisioning that what you're calling potato juice, which kind of sounds less romantically like potato wastewater. And that is the water for your fermentation and then the carbon source also? So is that also reducing not just your carbon needs, but also your water needs?
Yeah, absolutely. So that leftover waste stream is indeed the potato juice that we would take in. And actually, we're in that sense also a water purification company, because what we're actually doing in different stages is ultimately to extract all the valuable matter, but also the insoluble matters, and use that water in our processes. And also ultimately, any kind of water that would come from our process is suitable as ultimately drinking water after cleaning.
Wow, amazing. Okay. So what's the scale that you guys are at now? You mentioned, Mark, that you guys are getting to a point where you are going to be making an actual impact to save planet A here. So what is the scale that you're at? I know you have a pilot plant, right? And so where are we in terms of actual commercialization?
Yeah, so let me define also a bit, because that's where I'm a strong believer in ultimately the four steps of growing in chemistry. The business was founded 15 years ago at a university lab. One of the co-founders, he actually bought the patent, and that's something we have been scaling over
Yeah.
15 years.
And
We've had a pilot plant.
only because I've been there and I know how to pronounce it. I say it's at Wageningen University, right? So, yeah.
Well said, Paul. Well said. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not a Dutchman, as you can tell, but I've been to the university and I made an effort to learn how to pronounce Wageningen. So I just wanted to say it. So, okay, that's where it started in 2010. Okay, I'm ready for the rest.
And then following that, it has been scaled at pilot scale. So think of kilograms, pounds, as the size at which you operate a pilot plant. And ultimately in 2020, we've opened our demonstration facility in Amsterdam, which has been running now for 5 years consecutively at a kiloton scale, which is probably 2 million pounds, if you consider that. So, and I think that's a scale at which you have serious size vessels, fermenters, you get your feedstock delivered in truckloads, your piping is all interconnected, and that's the skill at which you really find out, and it's a very expensive skill to have, but it's the only way to find out how robust your process is. And that has given us a lot of learnings, but also a lot of possibilities to test a lot of different feedstocks as well.
And so is your goal to build your own commercial scale factory? So you've gone from, lab scale to pilot scale, and you're getting feedstock delivered by trucks. But in order to make the dent that you want to make, you're going to need a large scale fermentation facility with hundreds of thousands of liters of capacity, if not more. So is that the type of thing where you intend to build this yourself, or do you want to license your technology to a potato processor for them to build it on top of their facility? What's the actual business plan for getting to real commercialization?
Yeah. So on top of what we currently commercialize from our demo plant, it's going already into mainly animal health, animal nutrition sectors. We are currently raising funding for our first industrial scale plant. And that's going to be at a 20 kiloton scale size of pure fatty acids that we will produce in that facility. And that's going to be about 10 times bigger than the scale at which we operate.
How much do you need to get to that much production, to get to 20 kilotons of fatty acids annually? Like, what type of capital raise do you need? Because I believe that you've raised something like 11 million euros as your last raise. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think in total over the years, the company has raised about 40 million euros in
14.
40 in terms of
okay.
Equity, debt, and subsidies. And we're currently looking over 100 million to be able to build and operate that facility, which is also our strategy. So licensing options might be out there in the future, but we strongly believe that with the current commercial traction and our ability to actually put all the knowledge into a first industrial plant is something we believe is the best way forward.
And do you see that coming through venture capital equity dollars? Do you see it coming from governments or corporates? Like, what is the pathway to actually raising 100 million euros to do this?
So it's a combination of, I think, three things. It's the subsidy part that will help us, especially for sustainable initiatives like ours. There's sufficient funding in the Netherlands, but also in Europe available to do that. There is commercial debt available in the Netherlands, but also in Europe. And there will be an equity requirement. So these three elements will be there. And we've started with raising, and we have a lot of talks currently also with people that are interested to participate with an equity stake.
Okay, very cool. Well, that's exciting. I would imagine after 15 years of the company, you're ready to actually start making the dent for which this company was founded back in 2010. So I'm very excited and rooting hard for you all to raise that 100 million euros so that you can get to a place where you're starting to actually produce on a kiloton scale for these fatty acids. If you look at the venture capital space today, Marc, it's obviously not what it was 4 years ago. Back in 2021, VCs were interested in funding these big CapEx projects. It seems less so now. They seem like CapEx is like a dirty word now in the venture capital world. Has that been your experience? And if so, what are some other, perhaps even CapEx lighter ways that you might be looking to scale up or make sure your technology goes to good?
Yeah, so actually, I share your view on how the market has been, especially looking back over 20 years. There have been some bubbles out there as well, which attracted a lot of money as well to grow and scale in our business and in our industries. And today's market, with all the uncertainty in outlook, definitely a different story. So I'm well aware of the environment in which we're raising money. Having said that, we actually see that with the fact that we have that established demo robustness and the fact that we actually are able with our first industrial scale plant to offer products at price parity with the fossil carbon intensive counterparts makes it actually a very solid case. So next to, I would say, pure VC, we also have private equity, some infra funds, pension funds with whom we currently talk about our case. So yeah, in that sense, I'm not that I would say concerned about the interest for venture like this. And the reality is also, there are not many companies that make it actually through that valley of death, as it's
Yeah.
often called. And that from where we stand, the step to actually scaling it and look at an EBITDA positive outlook in a couple of years is pretty positive and pretty unique, I would say.
Yeah, and look, definitely less than 10% of startups make it to their fifth birthday. ChainCraft has made it to its 15th birthday, which is definitely, like a grizzled old age in startup land. So there is some longevity there for sure. And hopefully, if it's true that you guys are going to be EBITDA positive in only 2 years from now, that would be a pretty remarkable thing and would be a great success story for the company. So let me ask you, Marc, you have been involved on both sides of this coin, right? From big corporates to small startups. You've seen a lot in chemistry and in fermentation and biology. Are there things that you wish existed that don't, companies or services that you think would do something to contribute either to the cause for which you are currently fighting, to try to figure out how to more sustainably make fatty acids, or that would just make the world a better in some other way? Like, is there any company you wish existed that doesn't yet exist?
Well, I think if you look at what we're currently doing in the world when we're trying to add alternatives to the fossil source, I think we look at carbohydrate rich streams, which are often pure products. But I think there ultimately the demand for us as energy consumers and fuel consumers is just way too big, to ultimately do that with primary food grade material. So I think anybody that does anything suitable, useful with residual streams that are non-edible, I think deserves a lot of support and credit. And I see that in our space, but I also see that with companies that even take orange peels, for example, from what is squeezed in restaurants and in supermarkets to give you your fresh bottles. Ultimately, those peels are of value where you can extract essential oils and fibers from. So I think that's out there. I think the holy grail still, which hopefully for me gets it to technology that will techno and economically work out, is of course capturing carbon from the air. I think there's plenty of CO2 and methane out there. Let's use that as good as we can and let that be an ultimate carbon source.
Okay. Well, that is very cool. I am excited by that. And indeed, we had on a Mexican company called Polybion. I'm not sure if you've heard of them, but I'll link to their episode in the show notes for this episode at businessforgoodpodcast.com. But Polybion is basically using fruit waste, like you were talking about, like mango waste and orange waste and so on, in Mexico to run a fermentation process to make a material that, I don't know how similar to leather it is, but it's billed as like a leather alternative. But that's pretty cool to see that. So I'll send that to you as well, so you can take a look at it. But that's great. That's certainly exciting. I do think that there's just these rivers of carbon that we are throwing out, right? That we could be using if you can figure out the right type of fermentation to make it efficient in a product that is valuable enough to justify using that variable carbon source. Okay, finally, Marc, you've seen a lot, you've done a lot, you are probably have benefited from many resources that you've either read or seen. Is there something that you'd recommend? Any books, speeches, anything else that were useful for you in your journey here from major corporate to small startup?
Let me think about it. So yeah, I think first of all, there's a whole long list of books about scaling and startups, which I think all your listeners will already have on their shelves, or they're easy to find, right? What may be good is to say that I'm a bird watcher. And a lot of my inspiration I can find in nature and be fascinated and inspired by nature. So I think if I have to pick one, I think the book called Bird Sense from Tim Burkhead. He's a British ornithologist. Yeah, that's just a fantastic book that actually tries to answer the question of what it's like to be a bird. And he described, he's worked his whole life in actually understanding the senses of birds, done a lot of study work. So it leaves you with, I think, two things. You'll get a fascination for birds if you weren't already like I am, but also that we are kind of coexisting with that kind of creatures on Earth, which is great. And second, I think that it is a realization that if you're curious, there's still so much to learn and be inspired by that you actually can use. So yeah, that's definitely a book I would recommend.
All right, very nice. And I love birds. In fact, I have not one, not two, but 3 different bird baths for different sized birds so that I can attract them. And I have these motion censored cameras by them so I can, get a notification when the bird bath is in use. And I really love watching them. In fact, my wife and I had a big vegetable garden in the past. And it was always a source of frustration how wildlife would be eating it. And so I thought, why don't we just plant a bunch of flowers and leave it for the birds? And so now we've converted a lot of our vegetable space just to flower space. And to be honest with you, I got more pleasure watching the birds in the backyard going to all these flowers than I did from the produce, actually. So I am a big bird lover myself, and I have constructed a front and backyard that is trying to be more and more bird friendly every year because of that. But I've not read Bird Sense, and we'll include that in the show notes for this episode at businessforgoodpodcast.com. And so people can go check out that book. But your comments about what it's like to be a bird reminded me of a very famous essay by Thomas Nagel called What It's Like to Be a Bat. Have you heard of this? And it's basically arguing like it's hard to put yourself in the shoes of a bat that lives off of echolocation, right? Like for those of us who don't really utilize echolocation in our lives very much, it's hard to understand the world of what it is like to be a bat. And this philosopher named Thomas Nagel tries to go and figure out what it would be like to live in that world. I think it's very helpful for us.
You asked me about business books. I was just thinking about it. I must say, I tend to listen more to podcasts now. And if I maybe should recommend one next to yours, then of course, Paul, which is of course a great one, is one of our partner companies. Their CEO is Ilham Kadri. She is a CEO at ScienceCo, the former spin-off of Solvay Specialty Chemicals. Podcast called And is the Future. And it's about making business and sustainability and profitable. So making business sustainable and profitable. And I think those conversations that she has with former NASA astronauts, but also ex-CEOs like the Paul Polmans and Feike Siebersma's of this world, I think are a great source of inspiration, but also to reflect on for my own personal leadership and the choices that I make strategically with ChainCraft.
Okay, well, that's really exciting. I will definitely be checking out that podcast. I have not listened to it, but it sounds like one that is very up my alley. And I'd love to hear what Paul Pullman has to say from Unilever. So I look forward to checking that out, and we'll certainly include a link for that as well. But for now, Marc, we're rooting very hard for you to raise the capital you need to finally bring this technology to full-scale fruition and get kilotons of your fatty acids out there and relieve the pressure that we're putting on the forests of this world and also reduce a little bit of the demand for fossil fuels. So we're wishing you the best and really grateful for all that you're doing.
Amazing, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. I hope you found it useful, and if you did, please let the world know. Leave the show a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app and share the episode with your friends. Who knows? Maybe you'll inspire one of them to be in the business of doing good themselves.